And I'm very pleased to have two individuals here joining us to talk about anti-bias and equity in Montessori philosophy and practice. Our first speaker is Allison Jones, and she's with Public Montessori in Action, and she'll be speaking about seen, heard, and understood the true meaning of education for peace. And then we will shift directly into AERA Mogaji's, who is a member of the AMS Board of Directors, and she'll be talking about equity and inclusion in Montessori spaces. So I will stop sharing my screen so that Allison, you can begin sharing yours if you like.
Thank you so much. Okay. So today we're going to be talking about education for peace. I am, as Stephanie said, the Director of Implementation for Public Montessori in Action. I'm also the Director of Student Support for another public charter school in Washington, D.C., Breakthrough Montessori PCS. I was a Montessori child through 6th grade. I am primary and elementary trained, and I've been teaching in the Montessori and doing other things in the Montessori world for more years than I've counted at this point. So I am pretty steeped in Montessori. That said, from an equity lens, my presentation is comprised of pretty much the conversations, thoughts, and experiments that I and colleagues have been doing for the last 10 to 15 years. But for this presentation, I've tried to focus in a balanced manner because I talk a lot to Montessorians. I tend to be critical and think about what needs to change, but I think Montessori also has a lot of strengths. I want to start with a Montessori quote. This quote from Montessori's 1949 book, The Formation of Man, encapsulates the work of equitable education. This ideal is not unique to Montessori, but it takes on unique successes and challenges given Montessori's pedagogy, history, and the way that it's implemented today. I love how it highlights that education has to contribute to a movement of universal liberation. Otherwise, it's like an organ that's shriveled up. Maria, she has a way of putting things. A key tenet of the Montessori philosophy is education for peace, the idea that the most important goal of education is to establish lasting peace by helping children to develop into their best selves, the future leaders that our world needs. The pedagogy is centered around a holistic view of children and a belief in the unmanifested potential of each individual. This means that if it were carried out to its fullest potential, that each child in a Montessori environment would feel seen, would feel heard, would be understood for who they are and where they came from, would receive what they need to support their individual development, would have equitable access to learning resources like materials, would have equitable access to educational content, and would have equitable access to the resources of the world at large. This might seem like a big ask, but if our aim is to develop future leaders that will establish lasting peace for society, this seems like the bare minimum. Today, I'd like to talk about what's going well. Where has Montessori achieved these aims already? What needs work? Where has Montessori not achieved these aims? And what do we still not know? Possible further areas of research. I'm not a researcher myself, but there's a lot I'd like to know. So, I would love it if we planted some seeds today. I want to use this lens to examine 4 areas: race, diverse learners, English language learners, and family engagement. Clearly, I'm not going to go very deeply into each one because of time limitations, but I think those are some important areas of equity in general and in Montessori classrooms. For diverse learners, I put diverse learners instead of neurodiversity. I've recently been reading that some people with ADHD, for example, reject their inclusion in the term neurodiversity, but as my Montessori teacher used to say, that's a story for another day. So starting with race, implicit bias, and institutionalized bias. This is a Montessori quote about the educator's view of the child. As it stands, many, but certainly not all children experience this in Montessori environments, and further analysis is warranted. And I'll give you a second to read it. What's going well in Montessori is that Montessori has a robust cultural curriculum at all levels. The cultural curriculum is not extra, it's not something that's explored on special holidays. A sense of inquiry about the world and about one's place in it runs through all levels of Montessori learning. However, this also leads to one of the major fallacies of Montessori, that this, combined with the dedication to education for peace, is enough and our work is done. That's a fallacy. Without careful planning, the cultural curriculum can easily become cultural tourism. Without analysis, it can reinforce othering or ideas of us and them. To balance this, however, the Montessori community has been showing an increasing interest and investment in ABAR learning and culturally responsive teaching, as we just talked about with Baba Ize. And there have even been a few schools that have taken ABAR as their organizing principle. Related to the challenges outlined on the previous slide is the fact that Montessori is a pedagogy that was developed and put into practice by a white Christian woman in early 20th century Italy. It was designed through that lens. Since then, it's been a largely oral tradition passed down from trainer to trainer. Without detailed analysis of what's central to Montessori, be that philosophy or pedagogy, and what's a relic of the time and culture in which it's created, we can't serve children in an equitable manner. So, serving children in an equitable manner, in my opinion, requires three things. First is an analysis of the materials. Um, some examples that may be familiar to us: the Montessori Practical Life curriculum is meant to provide students with opportunities to practice activities of daily life out of context, which promotes their concentration, coordination, independence, and logical thinking. However, activities such as silver polishing, though a storied part of Montessori history, are not actually part of the daily lives of many Montessori children. Um, Activities such as hairbrushing, on the other hand, are clearly more accessible to and designed for white or Asian children and not Black children. Elementary stories, such as the story of the God who has no hands and the Three Kings, present similar issues of bias. The second is the preparation of the adult. In this case, the adult's ability to analyze what they're bringing to the material and to the classroom. Are they aware of their own bias? Are they aware of their own assumptions and what they view as normal? Are they ready to do the work to step outside of their own perspective and into the experience of the child? Are they aware of the institutionalized bias that pervades the history of the US educational system? These two ideas are not unique to Montessori. What's unique to Montessori is our ability to individualize materials, the curriculum, and children's experience in the classroom, which can be used in service of equity or not. The third is also a facet of all educational environments, but in Montessori has its unique quirks. This is a graph from 2016 from the National Center for Education Statistics, representing teachers and students in all American public schools. Research by our own Katie Brown and Mira Debs showed that Montessori public schools tend to be more diverse than private schools, but the diversity of the teacher pool is a known area of growth for Montessori schools and training centers. Also unique to Montessori spaces are the barriers involved in the Montessori teacher pipeline. In order to participate in high quality Montessori training, a prospective teacher needs to take a year or 3 summers of their life, with sometimes, without being able to work at the same time, so without income, in order to attend training full time. And it often means moving or living somewhere that's far from their home and their family. Being able to do these things requires privilege, which affects who can become a Montessori teacher and who children see in their classrooms. Mira Deb's research shows that while the major teacher training programs don't track data on participant race and ethnicity, preliminary data snapshots show that the Montessori teacher pool is, like the public teacher pool, predominantly white and female. So, as I said before, I'll preface this by saying I'm not a researcher and I haven't done an extensive inventory of the existing research, but here are some things I'd like to know more about. What is the ethnic makeup of the current Montessori teacher school? How about those trainees who complete their training successfully versus those who don't? Some anecdotal data from my own training said that there was a clear color differential in who graduated in 1 year and who didn't. What materials are common amongst private and public Montessori schools? What schools are doing good work with their BIPOC children and their boys, especially around discipline, and what practices do they have in common? Um, what Montessori schools have the best academic record for their BIPOC students? What practices do they have in common? What effect, like, does anti-bias training have an effect on discipline records? And if so, which types of training and practices are effective? So that is my beginning list of questions that I have. I'm sure the list is more exhaustive. Moving on to our diverse learners. Uh, what's going well is that first and foremost, Montessori offers an opportunity for infinite differentiation. Each child in a Montessori classroom already essentially has their own individualized education plan, though the rigor of data collection and analysis that's part of the IEP process is not necessarily in place in many Montessori classrooms. Montessori materials are concrete, hands-on, sensorially based, which work for many different types of learners. And individual and small group lessons allow for children to have breaks when they need them, for robust push-in support from specialists, and makes it so that students, and in a school setting, this is key, they don't miss general education content while receiving special education services because they get their lessons when they're in the classroom, and not, if they have if they have occupational therapy at 10, they're not going to miss history. Furthermore, Montessori's philosophy of individual progress through the curriculum and the multi-age classrooms make it so, unlike in a traditional setting, a third grader who's working at a first grade level and a first grade or who's working at a third grade level have peers and materials to work with, and they aren't visible in the same way as it might be in a general education classroom and everybody's working on X and Johnny's working on, some version of X or Y. And this means that all students can work on content at their level, just like everyone else. The converse question, of course, would be what's not working. The main thing I think would be the conflict, I believe unnecessary, between Montessori's constructivist philosophy and the behaviorist lens of special education. Because special educators and Montessorians often don't understand that they're two sides of the same coin with equivalent aims, and they don't understand each other's lenses, it's hard for them to work in concert. Montessori training is pretty clear that lessons should be presented exactly as they were in training every time. Most talented teachers naturally differentiate and make accommodations and modifications, but there's still a bias that lessons should be delivered exactly as one was taught in training, which is something that I think should be interrogated. And I mean, and granted, like, there are modifications and accommodations that go against Montessori philosophy and take lessons off the rails, but that doesn't mean that, Montessori philosophy also says we don't give the same thing to children every time. A lack of training. Many graduates of Montessori training have not been explicitly taught about the needs of diverse learners and how to recognize and respond to learning differences. While many Montessori pedagogical practices work very well for diverse learners, explicit knowledge of dyslexia, autism, ADHD, and other common characteristics that affect learning help teachers to better affect environmental and lesson modifications. A bias towards qualitative data. Montessorians have a strong tradition of observation and receive formal training in observational practices. This is a strength, but it's paired with a corresponding weakness when it comes to quantitative data. For students who are struggling academically or behaviorally or socially or emotionally, quantitative data can be a key part of decision-making and helps to eliminate teacher bias. And the last point I want to make here is about rubrics and explicit benchmarks. Montessori, well, my Montessori training at least went out of its way to not say what children should achieve by a certain point, which I understand the reason behind that. Children all achieve at their own pace, and the fact that a child doesn't know X by March of their second year in lower elementary doesn't mean they're not going to get to where they need to be by the end of third grade. But without rubrics and explicit benchmarks, teachers are left to make their own analysis, which research has shown is rife with teacher bias. So moving on to our English learners. Our first question, as always, is what is going well? Montessori material is concrete and hands-on. Children get a sensorial experience before they learn language. For example, this little girl here who is working on the third color box and having an experience of light colors and dark colors before receiving that language. Montessori classrooms have a very strong focus on exact vocabulary and repetition of vocabulary, which can be helpful for our English language learner students. Um, and we have an explicit vocabulary curriculum. Our, three-part cards are a way to explicitly teach vocabulary with a visual model, and Montessori has them for literally everything. Another area I'd like to highlight is grace and courtesy. It's my own personal theory that Montessori grace and courtesy lessons serve as effective explicit instruction in social language for English language learners. I'd like to be proven right. Possible area of study. And the third is that Montessori has multi-age classrooms. So students, and the classrooms function sort of as a mini society. So students have lots of examples of social language, interactions, examples by students who have a greater vocabulary and sentence structure, syntax than they do, which can be beneficial for our students who are learning language within the classroom. As for areas of growth, they're much the same as for diverse learners. Explicit training on the needs of English language learners is often not a part of Montessori training, and EL teachers and Montessori teachers can be less effective in working together because they don't have a clear understanding of what the other is trying to accomplish. Two specific challenges I would like to add in this area is that first, for our older EL students, the built-in supports for language learning quickly wane. The vocabulary cards, the grace and courtesy, singing and repetitive chants, many of the things that are staples of the primary classroom fall away at the age where students have mastered their first language, so aren't available to language learners in the upper levels. The second area to highlight, which also goes back to our diverse learners, is the difficulty of co-planning, because Montessori classrooms don't have a unit plan or, even really a static plan for the lessons that that child will for sure receive this week. It's difficult to pre-teach and post-teach vocabulary, and difficulty to plan for accommodations that help EL students to access grade level content. Thinking about our families. So this is actually a picture of Special Persons Day at my own school at Breakthrough, where children invite a special person, be that a family member, a friend, an adult who has meaning to them, into the classroom to give them lessons. I included families as one of the 4 categories because, research has shown that increased family engagement leads to better outcomes for children. And family engagement is an area that's been a bit rocky for Montessori schools, as Baba Aize was talking about before. But first, what's going well? Montessori philosophy takes a holistic and constructivist view of the child, which can be appealing to families. It's been shown that there's a demand for Montessori education amongst Black and Latino families, and an interest in an alternative child-centered pedagogy. When teachers and families work together in the service of students' development, there are infinite possibilities for environmental modifications and supports to support student experience. However, this is an area where I have more questions than not. Montessori schools have a reputation of being elite and exclusionary, and preaching to families instead of welcoming them. Many Montessori schools, my own included, are actively fighting against this. Small anecdote. Last year, I think it was, Baba Aize and some other members of the DC community held a forum for families of color to talk about their experiences in Montessori schools. And it was fascinating and just raised so many questions for me about what is working and what is not. Here are some of the questions that I have. What practices make Black and Indigenous people of color and low-income families feel welcome or excluded in Montessori environments? What Montessori practices promote the success of Black boys in Montessori environments? What type of family education helps families of color to be more engaged in Montessori environments? Does the Montessori practice of keeping classrooms as children's spaces actually lead to the outcomes such as independence that it's designed to? I could keep going. This is an area in which I have a lot of questions. I'm also interested in where Montessori schools go wrong, like which practices are exclusionary and off-putting, and how Montessori practices compare to child rearing practices in children's home environments. So to conclude, as I get to the end of my time, this is a movable alphabet in Canada, which is one of the languages spoken in India. One of the seminal experiences of my life was when I was in Mumbai, I think, and I got a sandpaper letter lesson in Gujarati. And all of a sudden, like the person was doing the lesson for me and they were like, which one is and which one is ah? And I was like, I have no clue. This is how the 3-year-olds feel. Those two things sound the same to me. And I put this here to remind us that Montessori is an international pedagogy. One paper estimated that there are over 22,000 Montessori schools worldwide. It's over 100 years old, and it's doing amazing work to support children and families of different backgrounds. I'm very excited to see how continuing research supports the development of what Maria Montessori called the scientific pedagogy, and to help practitioners follow all of the children. Thank you so much.